What's up, guys? In this video today, what we're going to be talking about is turbocharging Predator 212s and the reasons that you've never seen that work. And if you guys have watched my channel, by the way, thank you for visiting me here at Paul's Karts. If you guys have watched my channel, you know that everything I do is based off research I've done in the past. Now, I've done engine competitions for a long time now. This engine you're looking at here is an engine that I specifically built for a competition. And if you notice, there is no turbocharger on this. I've never built an engine with the turbocharger. Even though this engine you're looking at here is 467 cc's, which in its case might be able to get a turbo, but still, in fact, it does not have a turbo. So here's the things I want to talk about in this video. What I did was make a short list of 10 reasons why a turbo on a Predator 212 has not worked yet, most likely cannot work, and if you are going to try to turbocharge a small engine such as a Predator 212, this will relate to any small engine, basically any engine under 400 cc's. So what I did was make a list. This list is actually pages on pages long, and I'm going to give you guys the broad strokes of this. So I broke this down into 3 sections: turbo, the head, and the bottom end. Within those 3 sections of the turbo, the head, and the bottom end, I'll be able to give you guys the broad strokes on why turbocharging a Predator 212, GX200, or even up to a GX390 engine hasn't worked yet, and why I believe that you will never see one of those engines making real power with the turbocharger. So we'll start off at the turbo. So under turbo, I have 4 things that are required in order to have a turbo set up on an engine successful. So I'm going to go from the 10th or the bottom reasons, or the least effective things, all the way up to the number 1 reason, which will be the biggest reason why a turbo won't work on a Predator 212 or a small engine less than 400 cc's. So starting at the least reason, coming in under turbo, is going to be number 10 at heat. So turbos, unlike natural aspirated engines, they deal with exhaust. Now, when you're using exhaust to power the engine, capturing that exhaust is going to have its own set of problems. Number 1 being heat. Now, the heat from a turbo, or heat in general, is the fastest, it's the fastest thing that can kill a combustion engine, heat alone. So turbos generate massive amounts of heat. This needs to be dealt with. So, and that's what causes the engine to fail. Now, in Predator 212s or smaller engines than 400 cc's, there's a few things that's wrong with the whole setup on these engines to begin with. And when it comes to combating heat through the turbo, there's 2 ways to kind of deal with heat in the turbo. One is making sure you have enough oil, and another is an intercooler, which will cool the air charge into the engine. Now, granted, we're definitely starting off on the the furthest reaches of why these turbos don't work on these small engines, but heat is a definite problem that kills these engines. Now, I don't want to kind of say anything now that'll kind of give away stuff in the future, so we'll just kind of broad stroke that heat thing. Also things to remember about, you know, these engines, like especially a Predator 212, usually engines less than 400 cc's, they're usually not an air-cooled, a water-cooled engine. They're usually an air-cooled engine. And another thing is they're also a splash lubricated engine. If in fact the engine you're using is air-cooled and splash lubricated, these are just, you know, more reasons to amplify the heat that this setup is going to bring into the engine. So heat is going to come in on the bottom of the list. Now, the next thing we have after heat, you know, and there's two things that go along with heat, and this is all under the line of the turbo itself. So would be the intercooler, like I talked about. So number 9 would be, you know, the use of an intercooler. Now, so far in any of the videos that have been made and the research I've done, you know, turbos that are successful at creating horsepower. Now, an intercooler is not necessary, but if you were going to have a turbo setup, and especially in an application where it's a air-cooled engine, splash lubricated, you know, no real oil pump setup, an intercooler would dramatically help lower intake charges. You know, the setups that I have seen so far, they're not working. The reasons they're not working is because there's just no boost created by these turbos, and if there is any small amount of boost created, it's just insanely hot air, you know, and that, along with other things, you know, has its own line of problems. But in any turbo setup, an intercooler, so if we could get this functioning properly, as my train of thought thinks, is, you know, if you're going to build anything, you're going to build it to the best of your ability. Now, this would be my arrangement for the highest quality engine I could build with a turbo. So I would not pick a Predator 212 to turbo, but say if I did pick an engine of over 400 cc's, I would definitely have an intercooler in my system, just because it's proven and it works. So number 9 being the intercooler. So we'll go next to number 8. And we're going up towards the main reasons why this doesn't work, working back from 10 being the least, and number 1 reason would be the most, you know, defining reason of why these small engine turbos don't work. So now number 8, we come to oil. Now when I'm talking about number 8 and I'm talking about oil, I'm talking about still under the category of turbos. Like I said, this thing is going to be broken down into 3 separate things: the turbo, the head, and the engine itself, the bottom end. So still dealing in the turbo, being able to supply that turbo with enough oil, that is the number 1 reason a turbo fails. You know, it's oil starvation. Number 2 would be some oil contamination. So, you know, when it comes to oil in the turbos, everything I've seen has been using some kind of small aftermarket eBay type pump. Most likely those pumps are not adequate enough to pump the oil. In any engines like a Predator 212, usually engines less than 400 cc's, you know, especially power equipment type engines that use on go-karts and mini bikes, why these will be unsuccessful in oiling is because they're splash lubricated. Normally, if you had an oil pump within the case, like some of the new 196cc engines I've seen out there coming out, and like those Trax engines that have the oil pump on the side cover, if you could drill and tap into a passageway, maybe around the crank or the camshaft, depending upon where the oil pressure is coming out of, and you could harness some of that to power, or to use that to plumb into the turbocharger, being able to properly oil the turbocharger, that would greatly help increase the life of the turbo and the power it can produce. If you don't know, most turbos turn 100,000 RPMs easily. You know, Garnet has a VNT 15 turbo that turns 180,000 RPMs. Now that's insane. You know, most of these turbos, you know, some of them do get into like ball bearings, but most of them, ball bearings can't keep up with that. So what they use is, you know, either a bronze or a brass bushing of types, and they're just bathed in this constant supply of oil. So, you know, not having enough oil for this turbo will either cause the turbo to fail. The turbo can get some wobble in it. You know, if the bearings get or the bushings get worn out, you can get oil to start leaking past the seals into the intake or the exhaust side, causing a lot of oil to get into your engine, causes smoking problems such as this. So, a proper supply of oil. These ones down low on the list are kind of a stretch to why they're not working, but I wanted to bring out every aspect of research I've done into this issue to kind of shed some light on the things that you would have to think about if you were going to try to successfully turbocharge an engine. Let's go into number 7. All right, now number 7. When it comes to the turbo aspect of these 3 categories I'm breaking it into, turbo, head, and bottom end of the engine, number 7 is the most important when it comes to the turbo aspect. And what it is turbo quality. Now, turbo quality, has to do with the brand name of the turbo. Now, a lot of people have seen almost every single one of these turbos that I've seen put on one of these Predator 212s or any small type of engine has been a no-name eBay turbo. Now people might think, hey, it's, you know, a replica turbo, you know, it's the same turbo, what's he talking about? Well, quality control when it comes to turbos and how these turbos are remanufactured or designed is huge. I've seen turbos in videos where the nut has come off the impeller and completely, you know, grenaded this turbo, making it no longer effective. I mean, low quality turbos, they have bad seals. They have poor fit, which is one of the major things. It's a poor fit between the turbine and the turbine cover. Well, that turbine is spinning, and it's spinning inside of a housing. And if that turbine doesn't fit to that housing properly, it's just going to let any of the possible boost that it might be able to create just escape between the vanes. It's not an effective seal, so it's not being able to build pressure efficiently. Now, the turbos that are sold on eBay and stuff like that, you know, they say they're from this size engines to that size engine and can produce, maybe up to 100 horsepower of boost, they claim. 100 horsepower. Now, you know, when they're rating these things, every manufacturer out there is going for their maximum rating. They're not going to say, you know, this engine or this turbo produces 10, you know, horsepower, because no one will buy that. So they give these things at maximum ratings. The reason I'm talking about this will come up later on, and I'll touch back on that again. But I have some stuff written here. Poor quality turbos are bad at creating boost. The turbine design needed to create boost are patented and protected. So some of the major manufacturers like Garrett, you know, they make like people that make the T3 turbos, Turbogenics, people like that, you know, they have impeller designs that are patented, you know, and they're protected legally. So any of these people that come by and are making, you know, somewhat replica turbos, I mean, it's just a replica turbo housing. Those impellers and stuff like that are patented, and you know, so they change the designs, tweak it slightly to be able to produce it, but it's not the same. They're not high quality turbos. They're not, you know, sealed up. They don't have the correct impellers and turbines and bushings and fittings, and you know, they don't make as much boost as a proper turbo could. If they did perform the same, then there would be thousands and thousands and thousands of, you know, dollars lost to these huge companies, because like, what would be the point of you buying a more expensive turbo? There is absolutely quality control issues with these cheaper turbos. They're failure prone and their poor quality control makes them just a bad, you know, choice. So if I was going to build a turbocharged engine that was, say, you know, if I wanted to turbocharge this 460cc, I could turbocharge this. If I wanted to turbocharge this, there would be no way I would do it without a proper oil supply, a proper oil pump, you know, proper turbo, brand name turbo, with an intercooler, and and I would be doing everything I could to combat heat and everything I've talked about so far. So those are the things that are underlined under the first chapter of this video, which is turbo. Now, let's talk about the next thing in this video. So the next chapter in this video is going to be the head. Now, after you've got your turbo and you've plumbed it all up and you think everything is good on this far, so that air now is going into the head. So things that are on the head are your carb, and how are you going to get this now pressurized air, into the head with some fuel. So you need to think about your carburetor. I've seen a lot of these people mounting carburetors before the turbo, after the turbo, in boxes, out of boxes, fuel spraying out everywhere. They just can't seem to get a grip on how to figure it out. Now here's the thing. Every time I hear about a turbo on some website, it's like a 15-year-old kid or somewhere, a younger kid that's not quite, done the research or that doesn't quite know enough about these things, and all they hear is turbo and think, hell, I want to go out and buy a turbo. There is so many other aspects to the buying of the turbo, to getting that thing on your engine and functioning properly. I mean, you could go out buy a turbo for $150, do everything else, you're now at your $500, and like the other guys there that just did the video where they put it on a dyno, they made, less horsepower than you could make with that same engine just with the governor taken out and some heavy duty springs. I mean, they're invested big bucks into that thing and they're making less power. And there's reasons for that. So the carburetor setup that people have been trying to use is blow through, draw through, all of these kinds of things. If you were going to use a carburetor, you would need a proper blow-through carburetor. A blow-through carburetor, what it would need to function is, say if your turbo is mounted here and you have your intake pipe going into the carburetor, you would need to first of all seal off all of the carburetor ports that are brought to the atmosphere. You would need to drill and tap into the side of the bowl above the fuel line a fitting where after the turbo, close to the turbine, you would have to put in basically a pressure balancing supply line to supply pressure to the float bowl. What you always see is all this high pressure going in, and the way a carburetor works is as air passes over the needle, it draws fuel up from the float bowl. As the air is passing it, it goes into the airstream and gets sucked into the engine. Now in a turbo, that forced air comes into the intake. Now it's over the pressure of the atmosphere, so instead of it drawing fuel up through the needle, it's pushing the pressure back down the needle opposite of the way the fuel needs to go and squirting it out the bowl, all of the vents and stuff like that. So in order to make your carburetor be able to, now all carburetors can be converted to it, but in order to convert a carburetor such as this, you would need to have it plumbed up, have a pressure line connected to the float bowl above the fuel line, close off these atmospheric vents to create, and you need like a 1.3 to 1 ratio. So you would need, in the intake line, you would need, say, a big, like almost like a funnel type thing that goes inside the port of the intake tube that funnels down into a tube that goes into this, so you create a little bit more pressure in the float bowl than you do in the intake supply line. Now, this is even as a blow-through carburetor on a motor such as this, it might be doable. That would not be the way I go. If I was going to do this, it brings us to the next category in this, and in the head chapter of this, and this is fuel injection. Now fuel injection would definitely be the way I would go if I was going to be doing turbo on an engine. There are companies out there that make turbos, that make fuel injection, that make all of the parts for this stuff. Somebody's already tried to think it through. Now, the engines that they make these things for, just because somebody makes a part for an engine doesn't mean it's gonna work. You can't fall into traps. You know, people will see them, they'll have brand recognition, you know, they'll see somebody else have done it, you know, even though they've never seen it work, but they'll have seen somebody else say it in relation to, oh, a Predator 212, oh, a turbo, oh, somebody out there sells one, you know, in a kit for this. Well, just because all this stuff is sold doesn't mean anything is gonna work. You know, somebody's always out there to try to make a buck off somebody that's ignorant or misinformed. You know, so and that's just taking advantage of the public. So what I'm doing here is trying to bring some knowledge to hopefully help some people not make some mistakes, or if they're attempting to do this on an engine that's appropriately sized, to be able to do this correctly and actually make power with this process. So if you were, you know, going to have this done, you need to have fuel injection. Unless you wanted to try blow-through carb, it's absolutely probably plausible, but it would not be the way I would do it. If I was going to do it, I would be trying to do it to the best of my ability. Now, doing a turbo best needs fuel injection. You need to be able to fuel map that turbo's boost curve. You know, and every turbo basically has, you know, like a map that's associated with it when you're buying it. That's getting a little ahead of what I want to talk about now, but fuel injection would be the way to go. You would definitely need a way to, you know, add fuel as the curve goes up. There are kits out there. If in fact you have an appropriate size engine, one of those kits will in fact work. You know, even in like what I said about the carbureted version, you would still need a fuel pump. Now, a fuel pump is not fuel injection, but you would still need a fuel pump, because where the fuel is coming into the carburetor, if you were just not using a fuel pump, now you would need an electric fuel pump, not a pulse pump. Where the fuel outlet or inlet is on the carburetor, if you don't have a fuel pump, just the pressure, it's going to try to get out somewhere. So if you have the vents blocked and you have, you know, the tube in here applying pressure to the float bowl, so if you have pressure coming in through the venturi and pressure in the float bowl, that's now equalized so the flow can be metered properly, but it's still going to find its easiest way out, which will be through the intake where you're trying to put fuel in through gravity or something. So you're going to need a positive pressure going in through there. You know, at idle, you may need something like 1 psi. I think I did the math out, so you're going to need like 1 psi of pressure at idle, not too much where you're overpowering the needle in the seat, and then you're going to have to adjust your fuel curve through that fuel pump, and also when you do the balancing between the intake tube and the bottom of the float bowl, it'll auto enrichen, because as the boost rate grows, you're also going to be applying more boost to the float bowl in a 1-to-3 ratio if you've done it correctly, and it'll auto enrich in itself that way. So that would be the proper way to do blow-through carburetor. But fuel injection would be the way to go. So fuel injection would be the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, would be the 6th part of this. So part number 7. Now, what I always talk about in videos, and we're getting into like the top couple of these. So these are the things that are really starting to matter, like fuel injection, carburation. You know, this is tuning of the engine. You know, if you have a system that's working, you know, producing boost, and if you're not, you know, getting the fuel ratio correct, it doesn't matter if you're producing boost or not. You're either going to blow the engine or make no power. So when you get into things like fuel injection and carburetor, that's why I would definitely lean towards fuel injection, because that's the easiest way to be able to map something and keep your fuel ratios right where you want them, with you know simple tuning on a computer, you know. But you know, dealing with those things, that's something that you really have to stop and think about. This is not just buying a turbo and making it work. This is truly the difference between, you know, this couple $1,000 setup that you got here working or not working. Something as simple as doing things correctly. Now, that chapter is now over of the head. No, actually, we have one more with the head, and this is one of the more important aspects of this. Now, you have inside your head, you have valves. Now, this is where, you know, the whole entire build starts to take place around a turbo. This is where you're not just no longer slapping a turbo onto an engine. You have a specific, you know, a build based on, you know, what you're doing with your engine. I talk about this in almost every one of my videos. This is like, you know, basically how I did, you know, build all my power. It's through tuning. You know, I don't need turbos to make massive amounts of power. I have been successful at, you know, really massaging tons of power out of these unturbocharged engines. That said, if I did put a turbocharger on this engine and decided to dump another couple grand into this motor and wanted to perfect and tune a turbo engine, this would be the way I would do it, and this is how it could work on an engine of this size. Smaller than that, we would have problems. We'll talk about that in the future. So when it comes to the head, now you have an intake and an exhaust valve. Now, intake and exhaust valve on a naturally aspirated engine have a specific ratio. You know, and I've talked about that in other videos, like engine optimization and that whole playlist of creating a fifth cycle. Now, when you have that ratio of intake to exhaust, you know, on a naturally aspirated engine, you would love to just keep adding a bigger and bigger intake as long as you can keep adding the seat. You know, you're not really worried about your exhaust valve. On a turbo engine, you would want to almost have a 50-50 split, or even to some point start favoring the exhaust valve. And that's where exhaust shape and, you know, the way the exhaust flows and being able to really get the exhaust to the turbo correctly and smoothly in efficiency would really start to build power. So just the entire head setup, from the carburetor to the valve selection, you know, into all of your hot piping from the head to the turbo, this would all be into play in a turbo engine. So, you know, the same head that would work on a naturally aspirated engine would not work as efficiently as I would design a head for a turbo engine. So that right there sums up, I've already talked about the chapter of turbo, and that sums up the chapter of head. So we're getting into the best parts of this here, which are the bottom end. Now you're going to say, what the hell does the bottom end have to do with the turbo? Now, this is what it all comes down to. Now, in the least and most important of the bottom end is just strength. Now, when you're building a turbo setup, if your turbo setup is built correctly, this bottom end would definitely be able to handle a turbo. This engine was built to run on nitromethane, which in itself has its own oxygen content. It brings its own compression basically in with it. So this bottom end is basically, you know, welded along the spline, all underneath the flywheel. I have videos on that on my page. You can see the block and check it out. But building a bottom end that's able to hold a turbo. So far, you've seen these guys put turbos on engines that are bone stock, non-welded blocks, and they're not even making power. If I put a turbo engine on turbocharger on an engine, damn sure that block would have to be welded. Because the turbocharger setup I would do, you know, I would never put money into a design that would never work from the beginning. So I'm trying to help you guys from making mistakes that might have you guys that are, you know, trying to use your money wisely in these builds might think a turbocharger is a wise decision, and try to tell you why. Put your money elsewhere. You know, look at this engine. This thing is absolutely insane, from carb to the engine, welded block to the exhaust. The thing is just a monster. Has a head like this on there, custom made valve springs, and I'm making plenty of power without a turbo. So if you were going to go choose to do this, bottom end strength would be a must if you were going to truly build power. I'm talking about total sail rings. You want to be capturing that. You want to have everything true in the bore. You want to build that bottom end, balanced crankshaft, because turbos make power through RPM. So having a balanced bottom end, everything tightly sealed, you know, just the best of the best in the bottom end would be definitely the way you would want to go to build a turbo. Even clearances and things like billet pistons are absolute not recommendation, but are an absolute must to have correct. You have to have a billet piston. You know, cast pistons do bad with turbos. They get too hot too quick, pop the top of the piston off, and now you've got serious problems. So these are all things to think about when it comes to putting a turbo on. It's not just the turbo. There are so many other aspects of that engine that have to be changed and created to suit that turbo. $130, $150 turbo online sounds like a hell of a lot of horsepower you can put into your engine for $150. It's everything else that has to do with that turbo that costs you the fortune to get that thing going right. You know, if it's a couple $1,000 to get that setup on there, and it's probably going to be another $1,000 for sitting there testing, tuning, dynoing, you know, flow checking, timing checking, everything like that to truly get it to perform at its best. So that's number 8. Number 8's coming in at strength of the bottom end. Now number 9. This is one of the most important things, and things I've never heard anybody talk about, and you know, could actually truly help these people out. All these guys that I've seen build these engines, you know, they've talked about this, they've talked about that. I've seen some real decent attempts. Now guys, if you are somebody out there that has built one of these and you are watching this, I would definitely recommend you trying this. If you have a turbo on an engine right now, it has to do with your camshaft. Now your camshaft in the engine controls the valve opening and closing. A naturally aspirated engine and a turbo engine would need 2 completely different camshafts. So if you're thinking about putting a turbocharger on a stock cam, you know, this camshaft is not designed for intake pressure. That it's not going to hurt the cam. Or, you know, say if you go out and buy like a souped up, you know, cam from, say, Dyno Cams or whoever, and you want comp cams and you want to put in, you know, a camshaft into your engine. What it would take if you took a cam that, say, has overlap, like 108 degree lobe separation degree angle. Now, lobe separation degree angle is one of the most important parts of the camshaft that I'm talking about here. You know, it's not so much lift, it's not so much duration. If anything, you wouldn't need as much lift, you know, with turbo. You wouldn't need as much duration. But things like lobe separation degree angle are make or break for a turbo. Picture this in your head. You have turbo forcing air into this engine. The air is coming in here with a lot of pressure. Now you have an intake and an exhaust valve. So the intake valve opens and all this air is coming in, right? And, you know, it's building pressure, right? Because there's nowhere for it to go. That air is getting forced into the cylinder. There's nowhere for the air to go, so it builds pressure. Then you know, the intake valve closes, the piston comes up, and boom. That's how you think it's going to happen. Now, if you have a stock or a standard or any type of camshaft that you've just bought off the shelf anywhere, this is what really happens. That forced air is coming in. Your intake valve is open to let that air in, but you have overlap, which means your intake and your exhaust valves are open. And that could happen for, you know, a lot of duration on that piston rotation. So during all that time of overlap, so your lobe separation degree angle, so all that time of overlap in those valves, instead of creating boost in the cylinder or pressure, that pressure has a place to escape. So it's escaping right out that exhaust valve. That's why so many of these engines have never built boost. You see people, they have boost gauge on these things. They're showing, oh, it's making 10 pounds of boost. Bullshit, it's not making 10 pounds of boost. If it was making 10 pounds of boost, you know, the engine would have probably blown. They didn't even have a welded block. 10 pounds of boost would quadruple your horsepower. So that would put 25 horsepower through, you know, a stock Predator 212 engine. There's no way that engine had 12 pounds of boost at any point in time. It probably had -1 pound or maybe a pound of boost. If it even got itself back up to, it probably wasn't even as efficient as a naturally aspirated engine, and that's why it was making less horsepower in that video than a stock Predator with just upgraded valve springs and a removed governor would made. It made 8.5 horsepower when if you just take the stock, governor out of the engine and put some high pressure springs, you'd have like 11 to 12. So it doesn't make any sense to me why they spent all this money on a turbo. So when it comes to the last chapter, we've talked about bottom end. We talked about the cam. We talked about the strength. We talked about the cam and the lobe separation degree angle. So lobe separation degree angle, you would need something way over 110. 112 to 116 lobe separation degree angle, something where that exhaust valve is closed and it's closed early so you can start building boost faster. Any type of leak in that system, whether it's a bad valve job, piss poor piston rings, or anything like that, leaking head gasket, it would all be the same as a leaking head gasket. It would all just not build any boost. So the most important part of this whole damn thing of why small engines under 400 cc's don't make power? Can anyone know what it is? Does anyone keep knowing why I keep saying under 400 cc's? Why will a Predator 212 never make power with a turbo? Here it is. It's just, when you look at even the smallest turbos they sell, even of the poorest quality, so this is what everyone's doing. They're buying the smallest turbo they can find on eBay, and it's made with the poorest quality, poorest materials, shit, quality control, put on this engine completely wrong, bad oil pumps, no intercooler, no fuel injection, piss poor carburetor setup, wrong valves, wrong camshaft, everything is wrong. There's not a single aspect of that engine besides the fact that they bought the turbo, and even the turbo that they bought is a cheap shit turbo. That entire system was designed to fail. Every product that they bought on eBay was sold to be just a non-working bullshit part for the masses. This is that marketing scam. Even on the website, when you're looking at that turbo, it says not designed for engines under 400 cc's. Period. There's a reason why that turbo cannot be powered by a Predator 212. The Predator 212 is not making enough energy to spin the compressor side of that engine up to, 70,000 RPMs where it needs to be. It's the same philosophy why electric turbos don't work. You can't get those things to make boost. They don't spin fast enough. There's not enough power behind them. It's the same thing. If a 6 horsepower, if it only took 6 horsepower to power a turbo, don't you think on any type of race car they would just put in a 6.5 horsepower, Predator 212 under the hood to power their turbo instead of using, their own exhaust to power the turbo? When you use the exhaust to power the turbo, that exhaust causes it causes back pressure. That pressure is no longer able to freely exit the exhaust pipe. So it's causing back pressure behind the exhaust. The only way to combat that back pressure is by adding more boost. If you would just tune up the boost, and then you would, that's turbo lag. All that back pressure, that whole area of what turbo lag is, it's the area under the curve of the turbo where the turbo is not being powered enough for it to effectively, become an asset to your engine. On a Predator 212, it never gets into its power making zone. If you look at the turbos, first of all, they're cheap. Like I told you I would talk about in the past, it's the way that they market these turbos. They market it as, from 400cc to, X amount of cc engine. And it can make up to 100 horsepower. They are not focusing on the guys buying these for the 400cc. So they're trying to get the most out of this turbo. If you were to put it on your engine, you'd be looking for 20 horsepower. Maybe if you could get 20 horsepower out of a turbo on one of these engines, you're freaking doing it. But there's no way that turbo is designed to create boost in the 5 to 10 horsepower range. It's just not designed to do that. If in fact you did have this entire system functioning, if you wanted to successfully build one of these, you would need something over 400 cc's. Maybe a Predator 420, but that's cutting the line on one of those eBay generic shit turbos with bad seals and poor quality control and bad impeller design because they don't have the patents. If you in fact had a 460 like this that was properly built and tuned where, the exhaust is tuned correctly, everything has power where it's supposed to be, nothing's just out of whack, nothing's just hacked together in some backyard where it looks like, this thing just got pulled out of a dumpster, things looking like, alien creations coming out of them. If you wanted to truly make it out of a 460 and bought the best of the best, you could have a possibility of making some power. But there's a reason I don't have a turbo on this engine. It costs too damn much. This engine right here stands me over $5,000, and it's like, in order to put a turbo on it, how much money do you think you want to put into one of these engines? Is it plausible? Yes. Is it possible? Yes. But for a Predator 212, absolutely not. There's not enough. There's not even enough motor there to power the turbo, let alone power it enough to get power into the thing. It can't start that system. It takes power to power the turbo, which, takes power from the engine. So if you were just running a turbo, and the exhaust from the turbo, instead of using it to your good, if you were just venting that to atmosphere, it would take power to power that turbo alone. You know, eventually you get to the point where taking the power from your engine to power the turbo, the power it starts putting out that's going back in your intake, it starts a loop. So until that happens, that's the area of lag under the turbo. In a Predator 212, it never gets out of that lag area. It can't build enough boost to even supply itself to, you know, get back up to, you know, even a normal operating range. I hope you guys enjoyed this rant. Small engine turbos, why, pros and cons, why they do and do not work. Yes, they can work under the correct situations with the correct size engine, over 400 cc's, with a well-named brand turbo like Garrett or Turbotonics or something like that, with a proper intercooler, with proper fuel management, you know, with proper timing curve from like an MSD ignition system. That's not even something I talked about either. You know, you need to pull timing out of these things. You know, all of these aspects with the proper camshaft, you know, with the proper valve ratio, intake to exhaust, with the proper built bottom end. Can you build power with it? Yes. Is it feasible? Barely. Would I do it? No. So, till next time, this is Paul from Paul's Karts, bringing you guys another video. Hope you guys like it. Please subscribe. And until next time, you guys have a good day.